Okay, so we're back, and in this segment, I want to start off talking about lateralization. Lateralization refers to the specialization of function of the right brain versus the left brain. Now, this picture is showing you that in an adult, the kinds of things that are associated with the left brain: analytical thought, logic, language, because that's where Broca's area and Wernicke's area are. And then science and math tend to be in the temporal lobes of the left brain. So, left brain has some pretty specific functions. And then on the right brain, holistic thought, sort of seeing the big picture. Intuition, where you're not exactly sure why you know this is the right answer, but you know that it is. Creativity tends to be housed in the right brain. Appreciating art and music, producing art and music, these tend to be right brain functions. And then something that's not on the list that I wanted to add is that on the right brain, sort of right below your right ear, there's an area that's devoted to recognizing faces, a very specific area. And if you have damage to that area, you can develop something called prosopagnosia, where you literally cannot recognize people by face. You can recognize their voice, you can recognize their clothing, you might even recognize their smell, but you can't recognize their face. So there's a lot of times people look at the right brain and say, oh, well, it's just extra stuff, or it doesn't matter, and it's, doesn't do anything that important or whatever. First off, the things that are on that list on the right are important things. And then I'd also like to add, that's a really important thing, being able to recognize whether the thing that you're looking at is a face or not. And then within the world of faces, whether it's one that you recognize or not. I think that's a really big important thing. So these are the basic patterns of what the average person uses their left brain more for, and what the average person uses their right brain more for. Infants are not lateralized. Infants seem to process information just sort of in a global way. Now, it's tough to measure infants. You put them in the little electrical cap that, a lot of times they don't want to have the thing on their head. It doesn't hurt them. It has just little sponge kinds of pads that allow for contact between the scalp and the electrode that'll pick up the activity that's beneath it. But they can move a little bit and kind of make the cap go ajar. They don't really pay attention to the thing that you're trying to stimulate them with. And so, they may not be looking, or they may not hear what you said to them. It's all very difficult to really measure infants. So we have to be a little bit careful about how strongly I'm saying, oh, they don't have lateralization. But we think that they don't, because when they are presented with words, their whole brain lights up rather than just the left side of their brain. When they're presented with visual stimuli, their whole brain lights up, not just their right side, like an adult would do. And so we think that they are not born lateralized, but that they develop that as they grow and mature. Now, something I wanted to talk about a little bit that's not really covered in our textbook very much, and that is changing sleep patterns. In our last age group, we were talking about newborns and how, they go from, being in the womb, where they were oftentimes waking up just as mom was laying down. And so, mom's first weeks with this new baby can really be kind of punishing, because you've got this baby who wants to be awake exactly when mom normally wants to go to sleep and things like that. So I wanted to show you how sleep changes across the first 2 years of life. And you'll notice that this data starts with month 1. So the newborn period isn't really represented in this graphic. And you'll notice that there's different lines, and that's just sort of representing in this graphic, what 90% of the babies are doing, what 50% of the babies are doing, like that. So that's what these different lines are doing. So you can see that there's sort of a range where babies sleeps by 4 weeks of age, babies are sleeping somewhere between 9 and 19 hours a day, which is a pretty wide range. But by the time they get to 1 year, you're starting to see that range really narrow. And most babies are going to sleep somewhere between about 11 and a half hours and about 16 and a half hours in a day. Part of the variability on that, by the way, is because they rely on moms to keep sleep diaries for their babies, and they may not write down every nap and things like that. In fact, I thought it would be helpful to kind of show you this graphic that I got off the Pampers website, because they had the best depiction of this. But this is a pretty good depiction of how over the course of the first 9 months of life, babies really start to consolidate their sleep into the night hours and do less and less sleeping during the day hours. Babies at 9 months, a year, even at 2 years, still need to be taking naps during the day, but they are really consolidating their sleep into the night periods, which is a great benefit for parents because it's very hard to have your sleep disrupted all the time. But something else I needed to talk about that is in our textbook is sudden infant death syndrome. And I wanted to share with you this graphic that's from your textbook that shows how in the years leading up to the recommendation that babies be put down on their backs rather than on their stomachs, you see this dramatic drop from the years leading up to that advice to the years following that advice. Now, I noticed that 1993 is one of the years, and it's got a relatively high rate of SIDS deaths. My firstborn child was born in 1993, and they were at that time recommending that babies sleep on their sides. And that was tricky, man. You try and make a newborn stay on its side. You had to roll up little receiving blankets and make little bumpers for them so that they wouldn't fall onto their stomach or their back. The concern was, what if you have them on their back and they throw up? They could choke on it. So they were like, well, we don't want to tell them to put them on their backs, but if they're on their stomachs, they might, die of sudden infant death syndrome, because they were already starting to develop the hypothesis that sudden infant death syndrome was actually a baby who was breathing in too much of its own carbon dioxide and was unable or unwilling or, incapable of moving their head to get fresh air. And that's what was killing them. And so they're like, well, we don't want them on their stomachs. We don't want them on their backs. We'll tell them the side. And I mean, I fought with my poor little newborn so hard to keep her on her side. And you see the data, it doesn't look like it worked very well, right? Like you don't see much of a drop off of SIDS deaths between 1989 and 1993. So that probably wasn't the greatest advice. By 2001, they were very confidently saying, put your baby down on its back. It will not choke. It'll be fine. Put the baby on the back. And with this really powerful campaign, you see this really big drop off of SIDS deaths. So it is really important with small babies in particular. If you have an older baby who can roll over, this SIDS is not the issue. What you're worried about is a baby who can't roll over. And they can't roll over at least, they can usually go from front to back by about 4 months of age. And then from back to front is a little bit later. And so you want to put them on their backs while they're unable to get off their backs. Once they can roll over and stuff, they can roll over, and SIDS is probably not going to be a concern for them. There are a lot of factors that go into SIDS deaths, though. It's not just sleep position. We've also had, in exactly that same year span from 1989 to 2001, was a big push to reduce smoking. And smoking has, for a long time, been associated with sudden infant death. Just as much as they noticed that babies who had died while sleeping were typically on their stomachs, they also noticed that almost always their parents were smokers. And so there's a correlation between those two also. And to say the drop in SIDS that we're seeing in this graphic is completely attributable to sleep position is probably faulty. It's also partly because fewer parents are smoking. Other informational campaigns were undertaken during this period. It's not just about sleeping on your back. It's also about making sure that there's nothing in the crib for them to smother on. So little babies shouldn't have blankets in their beds. They should be wearing a warm sleeper that can move with them, so they can't get tangled in it and they can't choke themselves or smother themselves. They shouldn't have pillows, and they shouldn't have stuffed animals, and they shouldn't have anything in their crib. It should just be them in their crib. And so that information started to be really disseminated around this same period of time. So we have a third thing that contributed to the reduction in SIDS deaths. So it's not purely sleep position. I think a lot of parents get really wrapped up in concern that if their baby is found, fine and they're fine, but they're sleeping on their stomach, they're like, oh no, they could die of SIDS. Well, first off, if they got themselves into that position and you didn't leave them like that, that means they can move. And so they probably are not a SIDS candidate. But second off, if you've got an empty crib and it's just them in their nice warm, sleep sack or whatever, they're probably fine. You just don't want them to give them the mechanism for smothering themselves, and don't smoke around them. The other thing I wanted to add as an issue regarding sudden infant death syndrome is co-sleeping. The United States has a really low rate of co-sleeping. where babies sleep with their parents. And you look around the world, and it's really common for babies to sleep with their parents. In a lot of the most common co-sleeping areas are of Asian descent, but that's just a artifact of this particular graph. It turns out that pretty much everywhere else in the world, except for European countries, the US and Canada, Australia and New Zealand, any place other than that, babies tend to sleep with their parents. And it's really common for babies to have at least one adult who is sleeping with them, and that co-sleeping has been associated with a reduction in SIDS. There's something about having the parent there that keeps the baby breathing, prevents them from getting smothered. A lot of people really worry that if you co-sleep with a baby that you'll roll over on it and smother it like that. You'd have to be severely intoxicated, either with alcohol or drugs, to roll over onto a baby and smother it without being aware of that. That virtually never happens in a sober, healthy situation. And so it's a false flag kind of argument. What's it called? A red herring, to say, oh well, you'll smother your baby. That's not true. Really, if you notice the countries that really practice sleeping separately, they are countries that really value independence. And so I think it's part and parcel of that, the idea that the baby needs to learn from the beginning to sleep by itself, that it will interfere with mom and dad's sexual relationship, and that's harmful. And I would just argue that there are a lot of places where mom and dad can have sex. It doesn't have to be in the bed. So there's just a lot of things that we say as knee-jerk responses in the US that probably are not rooted in actual concerns, things that are actually the problem. The problem is we value independence, and so does the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. They value independence, and so in a culture where we value independence, we're going to see evidence of that in sleep patterns. But if a parent is honestly concerned about SIDS, co-sleeping seems to be associated with reductions in SIDS rates. So something to consider as an argument. But if you tell grandparents, cousins, uncles that you're co-sleeping with a baby here in the US, you'll oftentimes get unsolicited, very adamant advice about not doing it. So it's kind of tough to buck the social pressures, right? The social mores. All right, well, let's move on to perceptual development and talk first about how vision is developing. Babies can track and scan information better and better as they age. So here we have on the left-hand side 1-month-old looking at a human face, and the areas that have the little clusters of blue are where the baby spent a lot of time looking and staring. So you'll notice they stare at the chin and right above the hair the most. Little tiny bit on the eyes, but chin and above the head. And if you've ever held a 1-month-old, it does seem like they're looking over you. Like, why are you not looking at me? Because we as adults expect eye contact with somebody who we're holding 6 inches away from our face. But with a newborn, they'll tend to look above your head. Now you wait 1 more month, and now we have a 2-month-old, and notice no more chin and above the head really going on. Now what we're looking at is the mouth and the eyes. And they tend to lean towards the one direction on the eye too. They'll dart to the other one, but they have like their favorite eye that they'll lean towards. And so we see these changes in babies just over this 1-month period, and across infancy, you'll start to see them more and more honing in on facial expressions and the component factors of a face, and less on the edges, the distinction between the object and the background. Like they're doing as a 1-month-old, they're like, oh, well, that's where the person ends. By 2 months, 6 months, they're really focusing in on the face, and that's an important change, because that's going to allow them to develop socially as well. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop here because I have a few things to say about complexity and novelty. So let's go ahead and come back in the next segment, and we'll start with this.